Ray Charles. Billy Preston once said, almost like a quiet confession, "I love Ray Charles. He's my musical Jesus." He remembered how, back in school, he started a small group called Billy Preston and the Bills, and all they played were Ray Charles songs. For a kid from Los Angeles, that wasn't just fandom. It was a compass, a way of deciding who he wanted to be at the keyboard and who he was willing to leave behind. Years later, he would sit in studios with names people only read about on record sleeves: Leon Russell, Eric Clapton, and a long list of musicians who treated him like a secret weapon rather than a sideman. But underneath the applause and the credits, there were things Billy carried that never showed up in liner notes. There were connections, wounds, and loyalties that, according to people who were there at the very end, he never wanted to take with him into the dark. On the night of June 5, 2006, as the genius keyboardist who had stood beside the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Eric Clapton lay dying in a hospice room in Scottsdale, Arizona, the machines hummed louder than any crowd. The air smelled of antiseptic, not cigarette smoke and stage dust. Billy's hands, once steady enough to glide across a Hammond organ without missing a single note, trembled as he reached for a sheet of paper. Nurses later said he wrote down exactly 7 names. They were 7 black male artists, men whose paths had crossed his in ways the public never fully understood. Mentors, protectors, warning signs. Some people close to him believed it was not a scandal list, but a map of how he became who he was, a record of the men whose presence had shaped his music and his silence. And the first name, the one that unlocked a chain of memories that hurt to touch, was Richard, not a stranger, but Little Richard himself, the rock and roll fireball once hailed as the wild soul of American music and the first man to leave an unshakable mark on Billy Preston's childhood. 1. Little Richard, spiritual father or living storm. His real name was Richard Wayne Penniman, born December 5, 1932 in Macon, Georgia. He was the son of a bootlegger father and a devout Christian mother, raised in a house where church hymns and street noise collided every single day. From an early age, Richard lived caught between the pulpit and the club, between Sunday sermons and Saturday night drums. Instead of choosing one side, he decided to stand in the middle and scream loud enough for both to hear him. In 1955, when Tutti Frutti exploded across American radio, the country watched in shock as a black man in makeup, glittering clothes, and electric energy took the stage and refused to apologize for any of it. His vocals were wild, his performances outrageous, and his presence made even seasoned producers nervous. In an era when Hollywood carefully stepped around anything that looked queer, Richard was reported to joke backstage about his desires, saying things most people didn't dare to whisper at home. By 1956, Long Tall Sally had pushed him even higher. Legends like Elvis Presley and James Brown publicly called him an idol. But away from the cameras and magazine covers, his life, according to bandmates and old friends, blurred into a constant rush of touring, late-night parties, temptation, and running from himself. It was during those peak years, in the summer of 1958, that Richard visited a revival meeting in Los Angeles. The crowd expected a show. What they got instead was a different kind of spectacle. On the small church organ sat an one-year-old boy, thin shoulders, serious eyes, fingers moving with a confidence that didn't match his age. His name was Billy Preston, and he played like someone had quietly handed the keys of heaven to a child and asked him not to drop them. When the hymn ended, the room fell into a kind of stunned murmur. Richard, it was said, didn't even hesitate. He walked straight to Billy's mother, no small talk, no flattery, and simply said, "I want to take him on tour." That single line was less an offer and more a verdict. Days later, Billy packed up what little he had and left home, stepping onto a road packed with grown men, grown secrets, and a schedule no child could prepare for. From 1958 to 1962, Billy lived almost entirely in Little Richard's shadow. They crisscrossed America, Memphis, Chicago, New York, Paris, moving through train stations, side doors, and back entrances where the audience never saw them. Hotels blurred together. 1 bed, 2 beds, Separate rooms when the budget or the venue allowed it, shared space when it didn't. Richard started calling him Baby. Billy, half in jest and half in need, called him Daddy. At first, everyone around them thought it was just a tender nickname, the way a mentor might claim a protégé. But then there were the nights Billy didn't come down to dinner. The mornings, when he sat at the keyboard, hands poised over the keys but not playing, eyes red, face blank. Some crew members said they heard raised voices behind closed doors. Others remembered seeing Billy walk out of a room with his head down, arms wrapped around his chest, as if something inside him was trying to shake loose. No one asked questions. In that world, you didn't. One summer night in 1959, at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, a staff member later recalled hearing a door slam, music, laughter, then a long, unnatural silence from a room both Richard and Billy were known to share. The story went that the room stayed quiet for nearly 2 hours. When the door finally opened, Billy stepped out first. He didn't speak, didn't smile, just moved down the hallway like someone a few inches shorter than the boy who had gone in. From then on, people on the tour quietly agreed he wasn't the same kid anymore. Richard, on stage, never changed. He remained explosive, wild, electric, an untouchable storm with eyeliner and a Bible he carried when he felt like it. But for Billy, the man who had once been a mentor and gateway into the industry turned into something more complicated, something he could not quite name. A father figure, a star, a shield, and, in some unspoken way, a source of ache that leaked into his chords whether he wanted it to or not. Billy never gave the details. He never sat in front of a camera and spelled out what happened in those hotel hallways or on those midnight bus rides. But the shadows showed up in his music. On a TV appearance in 1981, while performing "You Are So Beautiful," some viewers claimed that, during the final line, he seemed to change the words under his breath. If you listen closely, they insisted, it sounds like he's whispering, "Why, Richard? Why?" Maybe it was just a trick of the microphone. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was the only way he knew to ask a question he'd never get answered. Little Richard in public became a symbol foundation stone of rock and roll, pioneer of gender-bending performance, proof that a black man from Georgia could shake the entire world with a piano and a scream. But in private, according to various biographies and interviews, his life was a constant tug of war. He swung between repentance and rebellion, between declaring he'd return to God and diving right back into the nightlife he'd just condemned. He spent time in religious communities, then came back to show business, giving interviews where he spoke about sin and temptation with a kind of restless honesty, admitting he was always looking for redemption, yet never fully able to let go of what pulled him off the path. Billy Preston was one small part of that storm. A name Richard almost never mentioned in later years, at least not in public. No long apologies, no detailed explanations, just the occasional fond remark about a talented kid who once played in his band. But in a late career interview, when Richard was asked what haunted him the most, he paused for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "There was a boy. I held his hand, and I don't know when I let go." He never said the boy's name. He didn't have to. For some people listening, the image landed like a stone at the bottom of a well. When little Richard died on May 9, 2020, newspapers around the world celebrated the legend, the sound, the style, the impact that lit the fuse for generations of artists after him. But almost no one mentioned Billy Preston. Few asked about the child who'd left home at 11 to follow a tornado in makeup and high heels, who carried organs bigger than his own body onto stages where grown men shouted his name and then forgot he was still just a boy. Only Billy, in the last thin stretch of his life, chose to write Richard's name down where someone else could read it. Not, it seemed, to take revenge. Not to expose a scandal, just to acknowledge what had already been carved into him decades before. For Billy Preston, the first name on that final list was Richard, the man who handed him music and, in the same motion, drew a silent line across the end of his childhood. According to people who claim to have heard the story from those at his bedside, there was no warning that the second name Billy Preston supposedly whispered on that crumpled sheet of paper would be Sly Stone. If that name really was there, some believed it was because, out of all the men who passed through his life, Sly was the one Billy could never cleanly separate from passion, addiction, fear, and music. With Sly, everything seemed fused together in one long blur, like a bad trip and a love song playing at the same time. And when that name was mentioned, no one could tell if Billy was recalling a friendship, a dependency, or something even he never fully defined. Sly Stone was born Sylvester Stewart on March 15, 1943, in Denton, Texas, and raised in Vallejo, California. The son of a strict Pentecostal family, young Sylvester sang gospel at 5, beat on drums by 7, and was fronting his own band by 11. The church gave him discipline. The streets gave him rhythm. Somewhere between the two, he found a version of himself that didn't belong entirely to either world. In the late 1960s, he formed Sly and the Family Stone, a band that was a revolution just by walking on stage. Black and white members, men and women, funk and rock, gospel and acid, all jammed together until the seams disappeared. They invented a sound that hadn't existed before, wild, rebellious, earthy, and strangely holy at the same time. In 1969, Everyday People hit #1 on the Billboard charts, and Sly became more than a musician. He was a phenomenon in platform boots, dark sunglasses, and a grin that said he knew exactly how much power he had. But behind the glasses and fringed leather jackets, the world was getting darker. The bigger he got, the more unstable the ground under his feet became. By the early 1970s, Sly's life, according to bandmates and journalists, was sinking into addiction and chaos, missed shows, tense rehearsals, whole days where no one knew exactly where he was or who he'd taken with him. Billy Preston crossed into that world sometime in early 1973 during a late-night jam session in San Francisco, where funk players drifted in and out until morning. At that point, Billy was drifting himself. He'd stepped away from the Beatles' orbit, watched his 1972 solo album Everybody Likes Some Kind of Music underperform, and was carrying the weight of memories he didn't discuss. He came to San Francisco like a man looking for a reset button, trying to erase the ghosts of Little Richard and the unnamed past. He didn't know he was walking toward something even darker. By then, Sly's Bay Area mansion had become a legend all its own. Musicians described it less as a house and more as a zone with no rules. People came and went at all hours. Clothes were optional, boundaries were blurred. The music was loud, the nights longer than they had any right to be, and almost no one was sober enough to tell the difference between a good idea and a ruined life. In 1974, a rumor spread through the funk scene about one particular night. It was said that Billy Preston arrived at Sly's place in a silver robe, carrying his Rhodes keyboard like a shield. According to those stories, he played for 3 hours straight, eyes closed, barely speaking, as if the keys were the only thing holding him together. When he finally stopped, witnesses claimed he smiled for a brief second and then collapsed on the floor. Whether from exhaustion, emotion, or something he had taken, nobody agreed. What most accounts did agree on was that after that night, Billy seemed permanently folded into Sly's circle. From 1974 to 1976, the two men were often seen moving between Los Angeles, Oakland, and back to San Francisco, working on recording projects that never officially saw the light of day. There were tales from studio staff of exploding tempers, pianos slammed shut, instruments knocked over, furious arguments that shook the walls. And yet, the next morning, people would find Billy and Sly sitting side by side, listening to the playback as if nothing had happened, their heads nodding in the same slow rhythm. On the outside, Billy began to change in ways that alarmed those who knew him from his church-rooted beginnings. He started wearing sunglasses in rooms with no windows. He wrote songs like a man racing something he couldn't outrun. He stopped talking about God in the way he once had, as if the language that used to save him no longer fit the life he was living. One stormy night on Sunset Boulevard in 1975, a friend reportedly spotted him sitting alone on the steps outside a studio, hair damp, shirt soaked, hands trembling. When the friend asked what was wrong, Billy's answer, as it was later retold, was simple and broken. "I don't know if I love Sly or hate him, but I can't leave." Whether it was a confession, a metaphor, or just a moment of weakness. Those words would follow him for years. Sly Stone was not famous for conventional romance. If anything, he was in love with freedom, with control, with the ability to bend a room to his will. When asked about Billy Preston in a 2003 interview, Sly reportedly chuckled and said, "I remember him playing like he was crying, and I like the kind of crying nobody hears." It was the kind of line that sounded like poetry and felt like a warning. After 1977, whatever bond they had began to fade. Billy checked into rehab and tried once again to rebuild himself away from the fog of substances and destructive patterns. Sly drifted in the opposite direction, further from the stage, further from the spotlight, further from the man who had once led entire crowds with a single shout. By 1980, stories had shifted from "Where's Sly playing next?" to "Did you hear where he was seen last?" He was spotted at gas stations, sliding into the back doors of small studios, showing up like a ghost and vanishing just as quickly. In 2011, a set of photographs published in a New York tabloid showed Sly living in a beat-up camper parked in an alley in Los Angeles. No steady electricity, no running water, far from the mansions and stadiums of his glory days. The image was brutal. A genius of funk reduced to a man in a van, his legend still echoing while his present looked almost unrecognizable. Billy, by contrast, had clawed his way back to a little light. He returned to the road, played with Eric Clapton, joined soul revival tours, celebrating the music of the 1,970 seconds. On stage, he looked like the old Billy again, hands flying, smile flashing, the organ once more his safe place. But those who traveled with him said that whenever San Francisco came up in conversation, or whenever someone mentioned Sly's name, Billy went quiet. His eyes would drift away, and he'd act like he hadn't heard the question. Only once, during a 1998 interview, did he offer a glimpse into what that chapter had meant. Asked about his time around Sly Stone and the Bay Area scene, he paused, then said slowly, "That's when I learned love isn't always salvation. Sometimes it's a drug, and sometimes it's both." He didn't explain what kind of love he meant, love of a person, of a lifestyle, of a dangerous freedom. He didn't have to. The line was enough. In 2023, Sly Stone stepped back into public view with a memoir titled "Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself Agent," where he wrote about his childhood, his rise, his excess, and his collapse. He acknowledged he had done wrong, hurt people, lost control, and lost himself. But when the subject turned to his sexuality, he simply said he had tried many things and never felt the need to give it a label. And when it came to Billy Preston, there was no detailed confession, no dramatic revelation, only the same silence that had hovered between them for decades. So if Sly's name truly sat on that final piece of paper beside Billy's hospital bed, it wasn't there as a neat chapter title in a love story. It was more like the name of a fault line, a reminder of the years when Billy's music burned brightest while the rest of his life fell apart. A man who helped him reach new musical heights and at the same time pulled him closer to the edge. Among the 7 men who were said to have marked Billy Preston's life in ways he could never quite erase, there was one who, by most accounts, never fully stepped across the line and yet left perhaps the deepest scar of all. That man was Donny Hathaway. They met in late 1969, when Donny had just signed his first recording deal with Atlantic and was still on the edge of becoming a name people would whisper with a kind of reverence. Billy, meanwhile, was drifting through a strange in-between phase after stepping away from the Beatles' orbit, trying to decide what came next and who, if anyone, he could lean on. Atlantic Studios in New York was where their paths crossed, not because a label executive put them together, but almost by accident. Donny was inside one of the rooms, testing a demo, his voice running slowly through a melody that still didn't have a final shape. Billy, as the story is often told, was just passing by the open doorway when the first few bars floated out. One intro, one line. It was enough to make him stop dead in the hallway. He stood there, silent, listening. There was something in Donny's chords that sounded like a confession Billy hadn't found the words for yet. They didn't rush to shake hands. There was no dramatic greeting. They simply looked at each other. The glass between the control room and the hallway turning into a mirror. Neither of them wanted to break. That first moment passed without an exchange of names, but they didn't look away. Not then. After that, Billy began showing up in the places Donnie was known to haunt. Not obsessively, not in a way anyone could call stalking, just often enough that coincidence started to look like something else. Long overnight sessions in Studio 3. 2 paper cups of cold coffee in a corner of Greenwich Village. Moments sitting side by side in the control room, saying nothing, rewinding half-finished takes as if they were searching for a hidden sentence somewhere between the bass line and the reverb. It wasn't friendship, not the casual, easy kind. It wasn't love either, at least not in any form they were willing to name. It was something that hovered in the middle, just close enough to make the heart lurch, just distant enough that neither of them had to admit what they were doing. Donnie was a rare kind of man. His voice felt like a blade wrapped in velvet, soft on the surface but sharp enough to cut straight through you if you listened too long. His music was soul-deep, gospel-rooted, but his eyes always seemed fixed on some faraway point no one else could see. In 1971, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a fact that would be mentioned in hushed tones in liner note histories and biographies. After that, he began closing doors on the industry, on friends, on almost anyone who tried to get too close. But no matter how suspicious or withdrawn he became, Billy was one of the few people Donnie never entirely pushed away. On the contrary, people who worked at the studios remembered small, strange moments. Whenever Billy walked into a room where Donnie was playing, there would be a tiny pause. Donnie would stop, hold the silence for a heartbeat, then continue as if nothing had happened. No formal invitation, no nod, just an unspoken acknowledgement that his presence had been noticed and accepted. In 1974, the distance between Donnie and the rest of the world sharpened into something more visible. He moved into room 1505 of the Essex House Hotel in Manhattan, and, according to those who pieced the timeline together later, he stayed there almost completely shut away for about 3 months. No gigs, minimal contact with family, no new sessions on the books. It was as if he'd sealed himself into a private chamber, building a spiritual coffin out of wallpaper and hotel furniture. Billy, people said, tried twice to breach that wall. The first time, he reportedly left a music book at the front desk, a page carefully marked and a handwritten note tucked inside. If you can't open the door, you can still open a song. The second time, he came and simply stood in the lobby. No demands, no phone call upstairs. Just waiting 3 hours straight, not expecting, not bargaining, just wanting to be the first face Donnie would see if he happened to step out of the elevator. But the doors never opened. Not for him, not that day. A few weeks later, Donnie returned to Atlantic Studios to record "Someday We'll All Be Free." It was a closed session. No one was allowed inside the room except the essential staff. The engineer on duty later recalled that when the final take ended, Donnie pulled off his headphones, lowered his head to the console, and stayed in that position motionless for a long stretch of silence, something like 15 minutes. Then he got up, walked out, and never came back to that studio again. On the night of January 13th, 1979, Donny Hathaway fell from the 15th floor of the Essex House. Official reports described it as a jump from a hotel window. No suicide note was found in the room, but stories circulated that in the pocket of his overcoat there was a crumpled scrap of paper with only 2 lines written on it. "I'm tired, but I still wish I could be free." The police labeled the death a suicide. His family, for years, preferred to call it an accident. Billy, in one of the rare moments when he allowed himself to be asked about it, refused to reduce Donnie's final act to a simple category. "People don't end their lives just because of despair," he was quoted as saying softly. "They do it when they don't know where to put their hope anymore." He didn't attend the funeral, he didn't make grand statements or sit for long TV specials about his fallen peer. But a few weeks later, in a small venue in Baltimore, he sat at the keyboard and played "A Song for You" in a way some witnesses said they had never heard before. There were no flashy flourishes that night, no theatrical runs up and down the keys, just a slow, steady, suffocating tenderness, like someone trying to speak through a closed door. And at the end, instead of singing the final words, he kept repeating the same chords over and over, as if he was clinging to a memory he knew was already slipping away. The audience clapped. Then, the moment was gone. But for Billy, something had been carved deeper. He never publicly spelled out what Donnie truly meant to him. Whatever he felt, whatever he hoped for, whatever he feared, Donnie seemed to take that unfinished piece with him when he left the world. There were no love letters, no photographs that proved anything, no taped confessions, just glances in hallways, late-night chords in Studio 3, a music book left at a hotel desk, and a lobby where no elevator doors opened. According to those who claimed to hear Billy's last attempts to make sense of his past, Donnie's name slipped from his lips in 2006 inches, a Scottsdale hospital room, so quietly it could have been mistaken for a prayer. Maybe, among all the names on that final list, Donny Hathaway really was the only one who never quite touched him in the way people usually mean. And maybe that was exactly why he never left. Because sometimes the deepest wound doesn't come from what happened, but from what never had the chance to exist. The love that stays hypothetical, the confession that never makes it past the throat, the hand that almost reaches out and then retreats. In the long, haunted catalog of Billy Preston's life, Donnie wasn't the loudest chapter. He was the empty space between lines, the quiet absence that kept echoing long after the music stopped. The list of 7 men that people claimed Billy Preston wrote at the very end of his life was disturbing not only because of who was supposedly on it, but because some of the names had never even been whispered in that kind of context before. They were men the public thought they understood, upright, polished, carefully managed figures whose reputations seemed too neat to ever be connected to hidden stories. If the accounts are to be believed, the 4th name was the one that made even Billy's closest friends blink in disbelief. It was Jermaine Jackson, the gentleman of the Jackson 5, the older brother, the most discreet and seemingly scandal-free member of a family already drowning in headlines. To most of the world, Jermaine was the calm center of a circus. To Billy, according to those end-of-life whispers, he was something far harder to define. Billy met Jermaine in 1976, just as the Jacksons were fighting to reinvent themselves after Motown, trying to seize control of their image in a landscape where Black American television was becoming a battlefield of perception. Every gesture had to be rehearsed. Every word had to be audience-safe. Approachable, but never too raw. Polite, but never offbeat. At the time, Billy was playing keyboards for some of their sets, drifting in and out of rehearsal rooms, hotel lobbies, and backstage corridors. He helped rearrange live numbers, glued tricky transitions together, made the show feel effortless even when the energy behind the scenes was anything but. Jermaine was the composed older brother in the middle of it all, often in a dark suit, speaking gently, smiling just enough when the cameras swung his way. Never more, never less. But things always look different when the cameras are off. During one brutal 10-hour rehearsal in Los Angeles, when the rest of the group finally took a break, most of the crew emptied out, grateful to escape the heat of the stage lights. According to a sound technician who later recounted the moment, only Jermaine and Billy stayed behind. The tech said he walked back in to check a microphone and stopped short. On the half-lit stage, Jermaine supposedly had one hand resting on Billy's shoulder. No movement. No performance. Just that. A quiet, steady touch, his head slightly bowed, lips moving as if he were saying something too soft to carry. The tech couldn't make out the words. What he remembered was the weight of the silence and the way Billy didn't step away. From 1976 to 1981, people who worked in their orbit often noticed a pattern. In official photographs, press shots, and TV specials, Jermaine and Billy were rarely side by side. One would be at the edge of the frame, the other somewhere behind the group, partially hidden. They didn't hold hands walking out from backstage. They didn't pose in ways that would raise questions. But crew members and bandmates would later say that, after a performance, there were stretches of time when both men seemed to vanish at once, then reappear, looking perfectly composed, jackets smoothed, ties straightened, as if nothing at all had happened in the missing minutes. In May 1981, during a special broadcast on Detroit television, producers reviewed an early rehearsal tape that never made it to air. People familiar with the story claimed that in one of the unused angles, Jermaine could be seen standing behind Billy on stage, arms wrapped loosely around his chest as they waited for the cameras to roll. From a distance, it looked almost casual, easy to miss if you blinked. But what made the producers quietly cut the clip, according to those who saw it, wasn't Jermaine's gesture. It was Billy's reaction. He turned, smiled faintly, and placed a hand over Jermaine's wrist, not pulling away, instead holding it there just long enough to be noticed if you knew what you were looking for. The public never saw that footage. It stayed in a vault, swallowed by years. Neither man brought it up in interviews. On paper, it might as well have never happened. In mid-1980, both Billy and the Jacksons took part in a program in Chicago. The group had their own limousine, a moving fortress that kept fans and questions at bay. That night, however, Jermaine did something that people close to the tour still talk about. He didn't ride with his brothers. Instead, witnesses said he chose a later car, quiet, unmarked, with a member of the music crew. Hotel staff later recalled seeing Billy and Jermaine arrive together in that separate vehicle, no one else inside, no one else invited. Billy stepped out first, eyes forward, expression neutral. Jermaine lingered for a moment in the open door, then buttoned his jacket carefully, adjusting his cufflinks like a man putting on a different face for the rest of the night. The staff remembered the detail because it looked, in their words, like he was shutting a door on himself before he walked through the lobby. No one ever produced photographs that proved anything beyond shared proximity. No one caught them in a compromising position. What people remembered instead was the silence, the looks traded in dark corners, the way they seemed to orbit each other backstage, always near but never too close under the lights. It was the kind of quiet only those who've lived through it can truly recognize. Billy never spoke Jermaine's name in interviews in a way that hinted at more than professional respect. But in 1995, during a conversation that barely aired, he did leave one fragment behind. "There was someone I loved once," he said, eyes down, fingers clasped together, "but I could only sit beside him in the dark, because only in the dark did he let himself be real." He didn't say who he meant. Fans and friends were left to fill in the blank on their own. As for Jermaine, his life took a different turn. In 1989, he converted to Islam, changed his habits, adjusted his diet, and began presenting himself in a calmer, more reserved way. He dressed more modestly, spoke more carefully, and appeared in public only when the moment demanded it. On the surface, it looked like a man seeking clarity, order, and a cleaner path after years spent inside one of the most scrutinized families on earth. His later years became tangled in other kinds of drama, family disputes, public disagreements, and a notorious feud with his brother Randy over the same woman. Those stories made the tabloids. Those were the controversies people were allowed to mention out loud. But almost no one ever asked him, on record, about the stretch from 1976 to 1981, when a soft-spoken keyboardist seemed to hover in his shadow at Motown tapings and tour rehearsals. In a small Chicago club in 2003, long after the big tours and television specials had faded, Billy sat down at the keys and did something that made the old crew members in the room sit a little straighter. He played "Let's Get Serious," Jermaine's biggest solo hit, but he slowed it down, stripped it bare, turned it into something almost unrecognizable. And when he reached the line "Loving You," some listeners swore they heard him shift it, barely, into "Losing You." The crowd didn't react. Most probably didn't notice. But a few of the people who had been there in the late 70s exchanged quiet glances. They understood that, for Billy, that song had stopped being just a cover. Maybe Jermaine Jackson will never confirm anything. Maybe he will keep his private life locked behind the same reserve he has carried for decades, answering only the questions he chooses. But if his name really did appear on that secret, unverified list that some say Billy Preston wrote in a hospice room in Scottsdale, then it may not have been there as an accusation. It may have been there as a final acknowledgement of a bond that never fully stepped into the light, a connection lived in shadows, rehearsals, and unspoken understanding. A reminder that for Billy, love sometimes meant sitting beside someone who would never risk being seen, holding your hand in the daylight. And in those last breaths, when he could finally write down what he'd never dared to say, Jermaine's name, according to the story, was one he chose not to erase. It began, as so many turning points in Billy Preston's life did, in a room full of noise, where he felt completely alone. The date was buried somewhere in the early '80s. In the middle of a long tour by one of the era's most provocative funk acts, a band led by a mercurial frontman who treated controversy like a second skin. Billy was there as a guest of honor, invited not because he needed the exposure, but because legends are good for business. Having him in the room made the party feel more important. The apartment was crowded, thick with cigarette smoke, bass bleeding through the walls from a stereo that had been turned up too loud hours ago. Bodies moved from room to room, laughing, arguing, flirting, forgetting where the night started. Billy drifted along the edges of it all, polite smile in place, glass in hand, eyes searching for an exit that didn't make him look ungrateful. And then he saw him. Standing alone by the kitchen counter, one elbow braced against the laminate, was a young bassist from the headlining band. Tall, wiry, dressed in black. He held a glass of champagne he never actually drank. The others called him Dre, a quiet nickname for someone who moved like a shadow behind the spotlight. He was known on stage for a hard, driving groove, and offstage for the way he avoided scandal without ever quite avoiding pain. Billy paused in the doorway, watching. Dre's gaze wasn't on the party. It was fixed on the floor, on some invisible crack only he could see. A superstar vocalist floated past, clapped him on the back, tried to joke him out of whatever mood he was in. Dre smiled once, thin and brittle, then went right back to staring at nothing. By dawn, the apartment had mostly emptied. The ringleader of the band had slipped out hours earlier. The last stragglers were asleep on whatever surface would hold them, couches, armchairs, even the floor. The music was still playing, but turned down to a dull heartbeat. In the far back room, where the light was weakest, Dre sat on the edge of a narrow bed, shoulders hunched, eyes hollowed out. Billy stepped into the doorway and waited. No clever line, no invitation, just presence. When Dre finally looked up, there was a small, silent moment neither of them would ever put into words. Billy walked over and sat beside him. No one remembers who reached for whom, or whether it even matters. What stayed in Billy's memory, according to those who heard fragments of the story later, was not the heat or the rush, but the way the room felt suddenly very quiet, as if the party outside had been placed on mute. They slept together that night, no declarations, no hand-holding, no promises about tomorrow. Just soft touches, quick enough to outrun fear, deep enough that running wouldn't help. It was the kind of encounter that should have dissolved by morning, the way most secrets do when the sun comes up. At 8:45 a.m., when Billy opened his eyes, the other side of the bed was empty. The imprint on the pillow was still there, faint and warm, but Dre was gone. No note on the nightstand. No scribbled phone number on the back of a napkin. The door had been locked from the outside, as if someone had made sure the night stayed folded in on itself. Billy lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, understanding that whatever had happened would not be revisited. In the months that followed, he saw Dre again, but never like that. They crossed paths in studios and backstage hallways, especially when the band worked in Los Angeles. Billy would walk over, offer a hello, maybe place a hand on his shoulder the way he used to do with younger musicians who needed grounding. Dre would stiffen, then gently step away, his eyes flashing with something that looked a lot like panic. According to one crew member, there was a moment in a dim hallway behind a soundstage when Billy tried just once to bridge the gap. He reached out, fingers brushing Dre's arm. Dre pulled back sharply and said, not loud but unmistakable, "We were together. One night, that's enough. Don't make this any harder for me." Then he walked away, leaving Billy in a strip of flickering fluorescent light that made the whole exchange feel like a scene from a film that would never be released. Not long after, Dre made a decision that left even his bandmates stunned. On the eve of a massive tour that critics swore would define an era, he quit. No farewell speech, no press conference, just a quiet exit. One day, he was in the final rehearsal. The next, his gear was gone from the studio. By the time the tour launched, he had already moved out of the city that had made him. Rumors surfaced, as they always do in the music world. Some said he couldn't stand living in the frontman's shadow. Others claimed an unnamed older artist had left a mark on him so deep he needed to run before the entire life he'd built cracked apart. In an obscure message board years later, buried among grainy photographs and bootleg recordings, one anonymous poster wrote, "The person Dre most wanted to forget is the one he still plays like he's remembering." No names, no dates, just that. Dre tried to build a solo career, releasing songs that flashed with promise but never quite caught fire. Tours were announced, then quietly canceled. Studio sessions started with excitement and ended with unanswered calls. By the late 80s, he had almost vanished working behind the scenes, producing small projects, staying just visible enough for die-hard fans to wonder where he'd gone, but not visible enough to invite real questions. Billy watched from a distance. He knew what it was to run. He knew what it was to bury versions of yourself so deeply that even you forget where they're hidden. When someone asked him, years later, about a certain bassist who used to play in one of the most famous bands in funk, he hesitated. Then he said, "Some people leave the stage to save what's left of themselves. Sometimes that's the bravest thing they ever do." He didn't say Dre's name. He didn't have to. For Billy, that one night was less about the body beside him and more about what it revealed, that even in a world overflowing with sound, there were still people who lived in absolute silence, terrified of being seen, wanting something they'd never been allowed to name. So when the story goes that Billy Preston, somewhere in the dim edge of his final hours, wrote down a fifth name, a quiet bassist who once chose flight over truth, it wasn't the name of a villain, it was the name of a ghost. Someone who had slipped into his life for a single night and then spent decades pretending it never happened, while Billy carried the memory like a hidden chord he could never quite stop hearing. Out of all the names people claimed were written on Billy Preston's final list, the sixth was described as the most haunting, not because there was ever a public scandal, but precisely because there wasn't. This man was a superstar, a velvet-voiced R&B icon whose entire career was built on love songs, devotion, and promises whispered into microphones. And yet, according to those who knew how to read between the lines, he spent his whole life running from the one truth he couldn't let anyone see. He was known to the world as Lionel Vance. Born in New York in the early 50s, raised in a small apartment where the radio never seemed to shut off, Lionel grew up on a diet of gospel harmonies and doo-wop records. When he finally stepped onto the stage in his own right, it was with a kind of quiet confidence that made people lean in. His ballads, songs about forever love, second chances, fathers and sons dominated the charts. He stood under the lights like a gentleman in a perfectly pressed suit, eyes closed, one hand resting softly against the mic stand. Publicly, Lionel was almost impossibly clean. No drunken outbursts on the evening news, no divorces dragged through tabloid mud. He never married, he never had children. He was, as reporters like to say, married to the music. His private life was locked away so tightly that fans built myths just to fill the silence. He lived for years in an upper-floor apartment on the west side of Manhattan, curtains always drawn just a little too carefully. He was rarely photographed outside of work. There were no candid shots of him leaving clubs at 3 a.m. No messy breakups caught on camera. Those who worked closest to him said that if you tried to ask about his personal life, the temperature in the room dropped. The only person who ever came close to breaking that invisible wall was a legendary soul singer and close friend. In a late 2010 Seconds interview, she hinted, without naming names, that a certain R&B giant had carried a secret all his life because he didn't want to disappoint his mother or the people who had decided what a real man was supposed to look like. Fans connected the dots. Some insisted she was talking about Lionel Vance. Others refused to believe it. Billy Preston, if the whispers are to be believed, knew the weight of that secret long before the public caught even a faint whiff of it. Between 1983 and 1989, Billy and Lionel shared the same orbit again and again. Soul Train tapings, televised award shows, charity galas where the cameras flashed non-stop, then suddenly went dark in the backstage corridors. Billy played keys on a handful of Lionel's shows, slipping into the band like a familiar ghost. One of the most remembered nights was a run at a Grand Theater in New York, where Lionel's voice filled the hall and Billy's keys sat just beneath it, invisible but essential. In a grainy backstage clip from an '80s awards gala that later circulated among fan circles, you can see them in the corner of the frame. There is no audio, just two men standing inches apart, facing each other. Lionel's gaze is downward, evasive, his shoulders tense. Billy's expression is the opposite, open, intent, almost pleading. They talk for nearly 3 minutes. Lionel doesn't look up once. Billy never looks away. A stagehand who claimed to witness that encounter later said, "I'd never seen anyone look at Lionel like that, and I'd never seen Lionel let anyone look at him that long." It was as if, in that quiet corner behind the glamour, two different lives were colliding, the one Lionel performed and the one he refused to name. But if the stories are true, it didn't end with looks. One winter night in 1985, after a high-profile fundraiser at a Beverly Hills hotel, Billy was meant to be driven straight home. Instead, according to one driver's account, he redirected the car to a small apartment off Sunset Boulevard, a place Lionel rented when he was in Los Angeles, a place without paparazzi at the door. The doorman later said, "I saw them walk in at about 1:10 a.m. together. The next morning, only one of them came out. What happened in those hours has never been documented in any official record. There are no photos, no recordings, no written confession. All that exists is a fragile story passed through a handful of friends who claim to have heard it from Billy himself." During his final weeks in Scottsdale, drifting in and out of consciousness while machines hummed around his bed, Billy was said to have whispered a single line about Lionel to someone sitting close enough to catch the words, "We shared a bed, just once. And the next morning, he left like I never existed." Was it literal? Was it metaphor? The way musicians sometimes turn life into poetry, even when they're not holding an instrument? No one can say for certain. What's clear is that, for Billy, that night, real or perceived, became a symbol of something larger. The experience of being allowed in, briefly, to a part of someone's truth that would be denied by daylight. Lionel Vance's story moved in a different direction. Years of punishing schedules, strict diets, and unspoken strain took their toll. In the early 2000s, he suffered a serious medical crisis that left him weakened and, for a time, unable to perform. He retreated further from public life. His family refused all questions about his private affairs. When interviewers circled around anything hinting at his sexuality, his team shut the door firmly. The backstage photos, the edited clips, the murmurs from session players, all of it was walled off by an industry that knew how to protect its saints, especially the ones whose images were built on romance. Lionel's legacy was carefully polished. The soundtracks to weddings, the songs people played at funerals, the voice that made mothers cry and couples sway in living rooms after midnight. There was no room in that story for a man who might have loved differently from the way he sang. Billy did not enjoy that kind of polished protection. He had already been through rehab, arrest, relapse, and public struggle. He did not have the luxury of a spotless narrative. Perhaps that's why, according to those who claim to have seen that final list, he wrote Lionel's name in ink that pressed deep into the paper, no hesitations, no crossouts. When a nurse, half curious and half afraid, supposedly asked why he'd hold on to the memory of someone who never openly acknowledged him, Billy's answer was soft. "Because for one night, I was the first person he let lose control, even if he took it back in the morning." It was never confirmed. Lionel Vance never stood at a podium and told the world who he really loved or what he had really done when the stage lights were off. The official biographies will always say he was private, dignified, focused only on the music. But if his name truly sat on that unverified list beside Billy's hospital bed, it may have been there for a simple, devastating reason. For Billy Preston, that single, unspoken night represented a lifetime of men who asked to be held in secret and then walked away pretending they'd never been touched at all. According to the version of the story that survives in whispers, no one in that hospice room expected the final name. The nurse taking notes thought she'd misheard. The friend sitting near the foot of the bed said his heart skipped. Billy Preston's hand, frail and shaking, moved across the paper one more time. The letters were slow but unmistakable. It wasn't an elder, not a mentor, not a peer from the early days of soul and rock. It was someone the world had watched grow up under stage lights. The man Billy supposedly wrote down last was a pop phenomenon the press once called the boy king of modern music, Marlon Chase. The first time Billy met Marlon was in the spring of 1974 on the set of a glitzy network showcase in Detroit. Billy was there as part of the house band, a seasoned player brought in to glue the show together with a few bars of organ and piano between acts. Marlon was barely a teenager then, a small figure in a sparkling jacket, already famous from a family group that could make an entire crowd scream in 3 notes or less. Every afternoon after rehearsal, the other kids in the group ran straight to their car, swallowed up by security teams and schedules. Marlon didn't. He lingered. He'd hang back near the edge of the stage, drifting toward Billy's roads like a moth toward a softer kind of light. Sometimes he swung his legs from a folding chair, sneakers not quite touching the floor, asking questions in a voice that hadn't finished changing yet. "Where did you learn to play like that? Do your hands ever get tired? How do you stop hearing the crowd when you close your eyes?" Billy would chuckle, give half answers, tease a little. But what he remembered years later wasn't the words. It was the way this kid watched him, an odd mix of curiosity, envy, and something like recognition. A child who already understood what it meant to be a product in a suit too small for the weight he was carrying. Back then, whatever existed between them was simple. A boy with rehearsed smiles. A musician who saw too much of himself in that boy's eyes. No lines crossed. Just brief, quiet moments in the wings, while the rest of the world cheered for something glittering and loud. Things changed in the early 80s. By 1985, Marlon Chase was no longer just a prodigy. He was an empire in human form, sold-out tours, platinum records, a face printed on posters, lunchboxes, and magazine covers. He moved with bodyguards, stylists, publicists, and lawyers, like a planet surrounded by its own orbiting moons. But for all the choreography and spectacle, the toll was starting to show. There were stories of exhaustion, of fainting spells, of nights where he disappeared into hotel rooms and refused to come out. It was in that era that Billy and Marlon collided again, this time on a historic anniversary special filmed in Los Angeles. It was the kind of show where producers spoke in decades, not minutes, yesterday, today, forever, and everyone in the building knew they were trying to capture something that would outlive them all. In a piece of rehearsal footage that never officially aired, a camera caught a brief, strange scene in a small practice room off the main stage. No one was supposed to be filming, but an operator doing equipment checks let the tape roll. Through the half-open door, you can see Billy and Marlon sitting close together on a narrow bench, a keyboard in front of them powered off. For nearly 2 hours, no one else was allowed in. No music plays, no choreographers' shout counts. When a stagehand finally cracked the door open, he saw Marlon resting his head against Billy's shoulder, eyes closed, hands clasped in his lap. Billy sat perfectly still beside him, staring at the far wall. No one was smiling. No one was speaking. The silence in the room was heavy enough that the stagehand backed out without saying a word. That night, when the taping wrapped and the after-party roared to life downstairs, Billy didn't stay long. According to hotel staff, he slipped out the side entrance with Marlon sometime after midnight. No entourage followed. No cameras flashed. The two men walked the hallway of the Beverly Regent Hotel side by side, heads bent, as if they were just two tired musicians trying to find a quiet place to breathe. They went into one of the upper-floor rooms around 1 a.m. A housekeeper later remembered seeing only 2 glasses of orange juice on the table and a single leather jacket thrown over the back of a chair. There were no raised voices, no music blasting through the walls, no chaos, just low murmur and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Whatever was said in those hours never made it into any interview. Billy didn't talk about it. Marlon couldn't. All anyone knows are fragments. A friend who claimed Billy described it as, "The first time I saw him without the mask," a passing remark that Marlon had sat on the floor, back against the bed, talking about feeling more like an object than a person. There were no dramatic confessions, no promises for the future, just 2 men, one burned out young and one burned out early, comparing scars in the half-dark. In public, Marlon's life only grew more unreal. He became the face of an entire era, a symbol of possibility, of spectacle, of black genius wrapped in sequins and stage lights. But behind the spectacle came lawsuits, whisper campaigns, accusations of manipulation and exploitation inside his own orbit. Tours were canceled. Appearances were postponed. He was shielded and pushed, protected and paraded, often in the same breath. Rumors gathered around him like storm clouds, but the real story, as usual, stayed locked behind closed doors. When he died in the late 2000s, officially from cardiac arrest, tied to a cocktail of prescription drugs, the headlines screamed about tragedy, pressure, and the cost of fame. Documentaries lined up to dissect his childhood, his handlers, his money, his myth. People wept in the streets. Candles crowded the sidewalks outside arenas he had once sold out. Almost no one mentioned Billy Preston. For most of the world, their names barely overlapped. One was the fifth Beatle and a soul-funk virtuoso whose life had veered in and out of trouble. The other was a pop monarch whose image had been polished, protected, and weaponized since he was a child. They lived in different stratospheres. That one quiet room, that one long night in a hotel where no one else was